The moment Michael Carter pushed open the glass door of Hartwell Technologies, he had no idea a single, accidental click would reshape two lives. He thought he was walking into another day of fixing someone else's problems for a paycheck he badly needed, not into the quiet fracture of a private world he would come to mend, and not into a question that would echo in his head for weeks. Am I pretty? Michael had been a repair technician for years, the kind of man who could coax stubborn machines back into life and make something complicated seem simple. He worked freelance because it let him pick up Hannah from school, pay the rent, and tuck his little girl into bed each night. His hands were calloused from years turning screws and replacing batteries, but his heart was softer than his weathered exterior let on. He kept a picture of Hannah taped to his toolbox, a small photo of a toothy smile and pigtails, the kind of image that made him tighten his jaw in gratitude and fear at once. The fear came from the precariousness of their life. One missed job could mean a domino of missed payments, a dinner of noodles instead of meat, another conversation with the landlord. But he never complained. He learned to hide worry behind an easy laugh and a stubborn work ethic. On a rainy Tuesday in late October, Michael took a job at Hartwell Technologies, a tech firm that had recently leapt into the public eye for an innovative health app. The receptionist, a brisk woman named Claire Fisher, led him to a tall office with floor-to-ceiling windows and a nameplate that read Elizabeth Grace Bennett, CEO. Elizabeth, or Grace, as the staff called her, was a woman whose presence filled a room, precise, intense, and perpetually 10 minutes ahead of anyone else. Rumor around the office called her brilliant, somewhat unapproachable, and ruthlessly private. Michael had heard that when Grace walked in, people straightened. When he set his toolbox down and began inspecting the laptop, he absorbed the room in the same way he inspected machines, quietly, respectfully, nodding where something might be wrong. Grace entered later, shorter than the photos in the magazines, with hair swept into a neat chignon, and a suit that made the receptionist's whispered admiration sound like a religion. She moved with the calm of someone who'd learned how to live in the shadow of expectations. Her face, when she looked up at him, softened briefly in a way that made Michael realize she was not immune to small human uncertainties. She was tired, a tired that hadn't anything to do with how late her meetings ran, and everything to do with the weight of being watched. Michael worked in silence, asking simple questions when he needed to. Did it shut down while you were in a meeting? Has the fan been making noise? Grace answered, clipped and to the point. When the computer finally hummed back to life, he asked if she wanted him to run a few diagnostics. She nodded, and he clicked through folders without thinking. He should have stopped there. He would say later that he was careless, that his fingers moved out of habit and familiarity with machines that kept their secrets in file paths and thumbnails. He should have closed the photo thumbnail when he saw her images. Instead, the screen flickered, and a small, private folder opened. There she was in a dozen frames, laughing with a man at a college graduation, standing at a seaside with a baby in a sling, sitting alone with a dog, sobbing into a jacket at an airport. One photograph was marked by a sticky note on the corner of the monitor, a candid of her, off guard and vulnerable. Michael felt like an intruder at a family dinner he hadn't been invited to. He clicked away and told himself it was none of his business, but he couldn't help noticing the photos were recent. A woman in a city dress and no makeup smiled the way people do when they're on the edge of relief, not performance. The right-hand corner of the image held a reflection, a man tall and broad, who Michael later learned was a former fiancé. The photograph was an intimacy, and it made Michael's chest ache in a way he didn't expect, not with lust but with a tender, hopeless sympathy. Grace caught him looking at the screen. She moved to the desk with a fluid, quiet anger. "Did you open that?" she said, not a question so much as a statement of fact. The office seemed to tilt. For a moment, Michael imagined the world would end in 1,000 no's, lawsuits, accusations, the end of a job he desperately needed. He felt exposed, like he had walked into someone's living room in his muddy boots. Michael had choices in that instant. He could lie. He could pretend he'd only run diagnostics. He could make up some technical reason. but lying felt like a thread that would strangle him later, so he put down his screwdriver and met her eyes. "I clicked by mistake. I'm really sorry, Miss Bennett. I didn't mean to," he cut off because he didn't know how to finish. He'd fixed laptops for people who'd asked him to pry open their photos. He'd never been the one standing in the doorway, watching the damage of curiosity. Grace's face changed in a way Michael didn't recognize at first. The polished CEO facade slipped, revealing something more human: alarm, hurt, and a raw embarrassment. Then she did something none of her staff had ever seen. She sat. She didn't hide her vulnerability. She folded it like a map and placed it on the desk. "You can go," she said. "I'll call the help desk." Michael's chest tightened. He imagined handing back the $100 he'd been promised, walking out into the drizzle, and telling Hannah that the job fell through. But Grace surprised him again. She looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Wait." He turned back and scrubbed a hand through his hair. "I am sorry," he said again, because that was the only thing that sounded true. Then Grace did something that would change both of them. She asked him to sit. Not to berate him or to fire him, but to talk like a human being. It began awkwardly. She apologized for the abruptness. He apologized for the intrusion. The rain turned into a private percussion on the window as they talked about small things at first: the busy phones, the new intern, how neither of them slept well. Michael told her about Hannah like he had told strangers in hospital waiting rooms: the proud father who would show a picture and say, "That's my girl," with his voice all soft. Grace, in turn, told him about being raised by a mother who taught her to be self-reliant and a father who insisted on pragmatism. She spoke about waking up one morning and realizing that the mirror and the company he built were two different things, and both expected her to be more than she felt. Then Grace surprised him again. She asked the question that had probably been on her mind for years. A question she had never asked anyone, and probably never intended to ask a technician on a rainy Tuesday. "Am I pretty?" It landed between them like a fragile animal. Michael thought of Hannah's small fingers, of how she would climb onto his lap and declare herself the prettiest princess in the world. He thought of the many women he had seen in magazines and on screens who looked a certain way, and the countless private and public things that had taught the world to wage a war between external beauty and inner value. Michael realized that in that moment, Grace wanted someone to see her without all the trappings, without press releases, without investors, without the chair at the head of the table. She wanted to be seen by one person as who she was. He could have given the stock answer, "Of course you are, who is?" But Michael had always believed truth was the only thing that mattered. "You are," he said, honest and simple. "Not because of the way your hair sits or the suit you wear. You're you." He watched her face as the words landed. Something softened, like a lock yielding to a key. Grace let out a breath, the kind that comes when a person is allowed to stop pretending. "Thank you," she whispered. There was gratitude in it, but also fear. The fear of being seen and the fear of being loved for that sight. From that vulnerable moment, a tent of trust was pitched between them. It wasn't romance fastened by a spark. It was two adults recognizing each other's loneliness and deciding, cautiously, to step in. Michael continued to come to Hartwell for small jobs, and Grace started letting him stay a few minutes longer than necessary. Their conversations unfolded into realness. About Hannah's first lost tooth, about the time Grace had failed at a venture and pretended to her board that nothing had happened. Michael helped fix more than laptops. He helped Grace open a window she'd kept shut. Grace, in return, taught Michael how to speak to investors and lent him books about personal finance. She introduced him to a woman named Rachel in HR who was practical and kind, and helped him set up his freelance invoices so they were easier to track. But life was not a movie with perfect arcs, and both of them faced real challenges that would test the fragile scaffolding of trust they'd built. Michael still worried about security. The moral panic of having seen private photos held him like a barbed wire. He worried that his wife's absence and his single status would one day be used to mock him. Grace feared being reduced to a question mark about her worth. The world outside their office misread their closeness and whispered rumors about favoritism. A rival board member, sensing weakness, began to nudge for control of Hartwell, arguing that Grace's personal entanglements made her unfit to lead. For Michael, a past scar resurfaced. His ex-wife, Rebecca, reappeared and asked for more money, claiming debt. Hannah's school required a new tuition fee that winter. The brakes on these small catastrophes were worn thin. They met these challenges the only way they could, with kindness, courage, and stubborn honesty. Michael sat down with Grace and told her everything that had happened. He explained how he'd seen the photos and how guilty he'd felt. Grace listened and then made it easier to breathe by forgiving him out loud. She made clear boundaries. Nothing private would be shared. No favors would be expected. She asked questions about his past and listened without judgment. Michael, for his part, apologized in front of her team when rumors started, not to dramatize but to be honest and set the record straight. His apology took courage. It also earned him a measure of respect he hadn't expected. Grace fought the board with the same precision she applied to every problem. She presented a plan, called meetings, and refused to be bullied by whispers. She hired a small PR team who spun a narrative of resilience rather than scandal. The board's motion failed, but it left a bruise. Grace learned to ask for help, not to be strong alone, but to be strong with others. Michael learned to ask for a fair wage and to set boundaries with Rebecca. He arranged a payment plan that allowed him to meet obligations without sacrificing Hannah's stability. He and Hannah spent winter evenings baking and reading, and he learned to laugh again in a way that made the apartment feel like a home. The physical and emotional repairs each required did not disappear with polite conversation. They were slow, messy, and sometimes humiliating. Yet the process of dealing with them together showed Michael and Grace that trust is built in the mundane. Showing up, saying sorry, forgiving, keeping promises. Their relationship deepened into an unexpected friendship that transformed both. Michael no longer saw himself simply as a man who fixed things. He saw himself as a man who could build a life that included more than worry. Grace no longer measured her worth by the meeting notes or the number of users on her app. She began to see that her value could exist independent of accolades. They did not rush into romance. They shared dinners with Hannah and taught her to water plants and repair a toy car. Hannah called Grace Auntie Grace at first and then Grace as she got older, the title a quiet testament to how gentleness can enter a child's vocabulary. The climax of their shared journey came 6 months later. Hartwell's big launch day arrived with more pressure than either had anticipated. An investor pulled out at the last minute, citing the earlier rumors. Without the funds, staff would be laid off and the product shelved. Michael watched Grace work through the night, her brow furrowed and her hands stained with coffee. He couldn't fix this problem with a screwdriver, but he could do something else. He called every small investor and entrepreneur he knew, told them about the app, and asked them to at least listen. His phone conversations were clumsy, heartfelt, and utterly sincere. He passed on names and anecdotes. Grace, in return, allowed vulnerability to be her strength when speaking to potential partners. She stopped hiding her scars and started telling stories about why the product mattered, stories that made people invest not only in a company, but in a mission. They raised the funds. Hartwell launched. More importantly, they had grown into people who could face a crisis without collapsing under shame or pride. At the launch party, Grace took the podium and thanked the team, and then, unexpectedly, she mentioned Michael and Hannah by name. She told the small crowd about a mechanic who taught her how to laugh and a little girl whose gummy smile reminded her that life had simple things worth protecting. The applause was not for a romance, but for the human mosaic they'd become. Challenges they faced: financial instability, single parenthood, breaches of privacy, power dynamics between employer and employee. Malicious rumors, family pressure, and fear of vulnerability. How they resolved them: through honest communication, setting clear boundaries, asking for help, practical problem solving, payment plans, bookkeeping, fundraising, community support, personal accountability, and choosing forgiveness and kindness over secrecy and shame. By the end of that winter, Michael and Grace were not fairy tale characters with perfect lives. They were still paying off debt, and Hannah still scraped her knees. But they had something more durable, a network of trust, a shared resilience, and a sense that their worth was not determined by what the world whispered. Grace finally felt seen, not as an image in a photograph or a headline, but as a person who could be loved and respected at once. Michael realized he could be both a father and a man who accepted love that wasn't transactional. Hannah learned that bravery could look like forgiveness and kindness could look like steady presence. On a spring morning, Grace placed a small framed photograph on Michael's workbench, a picture of Hannah and Michael with Grace in the background, all of them laughing. She hadn't staged the moment. It had been a genuine flash of joy during a weekend picnic where worries were momentarily forgotten. Michael looked at the photo and then at Grace. "Am I pretty?" she asked again, softly, not because she needed a compliment but because she wanted to hear that a life could be beautiful and messy and true. Michael smiled, pointing at Hannah's grin at the crooked picnic blanket at the sun catching on Grace's hair. "You are," he said. "Pretty isn't the point. You're whole, you're brave, you're real, and that's more than pretty." In time, the office lights dimmed less often because the company had survived. The headlines wrote themselves. Hartwell Technologies thrived. A CEO learned to be human. And a single dad found steady work and a friend who taught him that vulnerability was not a liability but a kind of courage. The true story, the one that didn't fit neatly into a press release, was quieter. It was about a father who learned to accept help, a CEO who learned to ask, a little girl who learned that families come in shapes that love can recognize, and a world where two people found, through honesty and effort, the right kind of repair. The final scene was simple. Michael, with a coffee-stained sleeve, fixing a small toy car while Hannah narrated the imaginary race. Grace sat nearby, proposal documents and investor notes open but ignored, listening. The rain pattered gently outside, a familiar rhythm. Michael glanced up and Grace caught his eye. She didn't ask this time. She already knew the answer, and the way Michael's eyes crinkled when he smiled told her that some things were finally in their right place. They had come to understand that being pretty was small compared to being seen, and being seen was the bravest kind of beauty there is.